The father had spent years in the military, and more specifically, in the Green Berets. He wasn't just trained in combat, he was a master of survival, strategy, and thinking on his feet. His job was to handle the impossible, to take on missions no one else could. But none of that prepared him for the quiet life he had chosen afterward, away from the chaos of war. His daughter, a bright and curious 10-year-old, had always been his anchor. She had his eyes, and his sense of determination. Their relationship was strong, built on shared moments, long talks about life, and the bond of being a father and daughter. They lived in a small town, far from the noise of the city. Their house sat on the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the sky seemed to stretch forever. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The father often joked that his daughter's laughter was the loudest sound in the neighborhood. Despite his background, he had become comfortable in this quiet world. He had worked hard to keep his past behind him, to shield his daughter from the dangers he'd faced. But sometimes, when he sat alone at night, a nagging feeling tugged at him. His training told him that nothing was ever truly safe. It was one of those quiet nights when things first began to change. The sky was clear, the stars barely visible through the thick trees surrounding their property. The father had just finished his late dinner when he heard the soft sound of movement outside, faint but unmistakable. He thought nothing of it at first, maybe a deer, or some other animal passing through. But then he heard it again. And again. The pattern didn't feel right. His instincts flared to life. He went outside, keeping low to the ground. The air felt different, colder, and he noticed a strange stillness in the forest. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He moved toward the barn, the last place he thought anything could be hiding. As he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, hovering just above the ground, were strange lights, bright, almost blinding, but not from any known source. The lights danced in the sky, moving erratically. His heart began to race, but his military training took over. He didn't panic. He crouched low, slipping into the shadows of the trees. From a distance, he could see figures moving under the lights, strange shapes that didn't quite fit any human form. They were too tall, too thin. The father's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced through every possibility. This was no prank. No human had this kind of technology. He knew he wasn't imagining things. Whatever was out there, it was real. He thought of his daughter immediately. The house was only a few hundred feet away, but it might as well have been miles. He had to get to her. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran silently through the woods, his mind working in overdrive, calculating every move. When he reached the back door of the house, he found it unlocked. He didn't bother knocking. He knew the importance of speed. He slipped inside, careful not to wake her. She was fast asleep in her room, unaware of the danger outside. His eyes scanned the room, settling on the window. The lights were still there, glowing in the distance. He knew they were getting closer. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. Those lights weren't just a threat to him. They were a threat to her, to everything he had worked to protect. His mind snapped back to his training, assessment first, action second. He grabbed a few items from around the house, things he could use in case of an emergency. There were no weapons nearby. He hadn't needed them in years. But the tools and supplies he had stashed away in case something went wrong were enough for now. He could rely on his body, his mind, and his experience to get through whatever came next. With one last look at his daughter, still sound asleep, he made his way outside once again. As he moved, his mind kept turning over the possibilities. Could it be military? A new type of experimental technology? No. The lights were too strange, and the movement of the figures was too fluid, almost unnatural. Aliens. The thought was impossible. He wasn't the kind of man to believe in things like that. He trusted what he could see and touch. But tonight, everything was different. He set up a makeshift perimeter around the house, traps, noisemakers, anything that might buy him time. He couldn't rely on anyone else. He knew this situation was bigger than what he could handle alone, but he had no choice. His daughter's life was on the line. The next few hours felt like days. The father stayed hidden in the dark, watching the alien figures get closer. He could hear the faint hum of their technology, a sound that set his nerves on edge. He was out of his element, but his mind raced as he recalled every mission he had ever been on. His survival instincts, honed through years of training and experience, kept him calm. He knew he was being watched, but he had learned long ago how to remain unseen. It wasn't until the aliens were almost at the edge of his property that he finally saw what they intended to do. One of the figures, taller than the rest, stepped forward and seemed to scan the area, its eyes glowing a strange, sickly green. The others moved in closer, almost like they were preparing to move in on his daughter's room. His blood ran cold. They weren't just investigating, they were preparing to abduct her. His breath quickened, but he steadied himself. This wasn't the time for fear. It was the time for action. The father moved quickly but silently, positioning himself between the aliens and his daughter. He couldn't make a sound, but he knew he had only one shot at this. His military training had always taught him that the first move was everything. As the aliens drew closer, he raised a small, concealed flare gun, aiming at the group. The loud bang echoed through the night. Bright, blinding light exploded in the air, temporarily blinding the aliens. They stumbled backward in confusion. It was enough of a distraction. The father sprinted back toward the house, his every move calculated, his mind focused. His training had kicked in fully now. This was what he had been trained for, the thing he had always feared, protecting the people he loved from an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with. The father stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights in the distance weren't normal. There was no mistaking it now, something was wrong. His military instincts kicked in. He scanned the surrounding trees, alert to any movement, any sound. The air felt heavy, thick with the sense of something looming. He had never experienced anything like this before, but his training had taught him to trust his senses. His first thought was to protect his daughter, but he couldn't let panic cloud his judgment. He needed to figure out what was happening. The next few nights were a blur of strange occurrences. At first, it was just odd sounds, whispers on the wind, things moving in the trees. Then came the shapes. Shadows, figures just beyond the edge of his vision, barely visible but always there, watching. The father knew better than to jump to conclusions. He knew that fear could make the mind play tricks. But there was something different about this. It wasn't just his mind. It was too consistent, too deliberate. He started taking precautions. He set up motion sensors, checked the locks on the windows and doors, and even started carrying a knife on him again, a habit he had long since abandoned. He hadn't expected to need it. But his instincts told him that something was coming. He had to be ready. The night it happened, he was outside, checking the perimeter. The stars were sharp in the sky, but everything else was eerily still. No animals, no sounds of the wind, just silence. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, his every sense on high alert. Then he saw it. The lights again, much closer this time. They hovered in the sky, not moving like any aircraft he had ever seen. They were too erratic, too unnatural. And there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. They weren't just lights in the sky. They were the beginning of something else. He knew it, deep in his gut. The aliens were here. His mind raced. He couldn't think of a single rational explanation. Aliens weren't supposed to be real. The government didn't know about them. If they did, they weren't telling anyone. He had to face the truth, though, and it wasn't an easy one. Whoever, or whatever, these beings were, they weren't human. They had technology that far outstripped anything he had seen in his time with the Green Berets. The father's next move was instinctive. He didn't know how many there were or what they wanted, but he didn't need to know. He just needed to act. He had fought in wars, survived impossible situations, and had been trained to think through every angle, to control the chaos around him. But this was something else. These were creatures that didn't belong on Earth. They moved with a fluidity that was both unsettling and terrifying. And they were getting closer. His first thought was to get his daughter out of there, but he quickly realized that wasn't an option. Running would only make them more vulnerable. He needed to outsmart them, not run from them. The father's mind shifted into overdrive. He started thinking through his options. What could he use to protect his family? There were no weapons nearby, nothing that could match whatever technology they had. But that didn't matter. He had his wits, and he had the training to handle anything. He made his way to the barn, moving carefully so as not to alert them. Once inside, he pulled out some of his old equipment, gear he hadn't used in years but still kept in case of emergencies. He wasn't sure what he'd need, but he had to be ready. He rigged the barn's doors to lock automatically, creating a barrier between the house and whatever was out there. He had no idea how long he had before the aliens came any closer, but he knew he had to act fast. The next hour felt like days. He heard the subtle hum of their craft overhead, a noise that was both alien and oddly mechanical. It was clear they weren't just here to observe. Whatever their mission was, it involved his daughter. He couldn't allow that to happen. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he couldn't afford fear. He focused, remembering his training, survival, combat, and strategy. In the field, when things got messy, it was always the ability to stay calm that separated the survivors from the dead. The lights from above grew brighter, and he saw the first of the figures, tall, thin, and vaguely humanoid. The father's first instinct was to move in closer, observe, understand what he was up against. But the danger was real. This wasn't a random encounter. These beings had a purpose, and the father was determined to stop them before they could complete whatever mission they had in mind. He watched carefully as more of the figures appeared, moving with strange precision, their steps coordinated. They didn't seem to notice him immediately, and that gave him an edge. His Green Beret training had always been about staying hidden, blending into the surroundings, and using the environment to his advantage. As he crouched low, he watched the aliens circle the house. His mind raced through all the possible tactics. He couldn't let them get close to his daughter, couldn't let them figure out where she was hiding. He had one shot to stop them. The father moved quickly but quietly, positioning himself in the trees near the house. He had noticed a weak point in their pattern. The aliens always moved in one direction. They didn't anticipate anyone fighting back. They were used to being unchallenged, to having the upper hand. That was their mistake. The father took a deep breath, steadying himself. He needed to be quick. His plan wasn't complicated, but it had to work. As the aliens approached, he fired a flare into the sky. It erupted in a burst of light, blinding the aliens for just a moment. That was all he needed. Using the distraction, he moved fast, circling around to the side of the house. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about fighting them head-on. It was about outsmarting them. The aliens recoiled from the sudden burst of light, and that hesitation was enough. The father's heart pounded in his ears, but his focus didn't waver. He wasn't going to let them take his daughter. He had trained for moments like this, and he would use everything he had learned to protect her. The father stood motionless in the dark, his mind racing. He knew his daughter was in danger, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill threat, it was something far worse. The aliens were closing in, and he had to act fast. His military training was his only advantage now, and he wasn't about to let it go to waste. He knew they had technology far beyond anything he'd ever seen, but he had something they didn't: years of tactical experience, and the raw instinct to protect those he loved. He needed to think, and think fast. The first step was clear: he couldn't let them take his daughter. He'd fought battles before, but this was a different kind of war, an invisible enemy, moving in ways he couldn't predict. His mind flicked through his training, considering all the ways to fight back. The more he thought, the clearer it became: this wasn't about brute force. He couldn't match their technology with weapons, he had to outsmart them. His first priority was setting up a perimeter. He wasn't sure how much time he had, but every second counted. He moved quickly, pulling together whatever he could: tools, makeshift weapons, anything that could give him an edge. His eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for anything he could use to create an advantage. He needed to create distractions, misdirect them, force them to make a mistake. The father's training had always been about survival, thinking on his feet, using whatever was available. He was resourceful, and in this moment, he would need to be more resourceful than ever. He set up trip wires in the trees, positioned noisemakers around the house, and built barriers from anything he could find. It wasn't about taking the fight to them. It was about making them think they were in control when they weren't. As he worked, his mind stayed focused. The fear was there, of course. It had to be. But fear could be managed, controlled. What mattered now was the plan. Every step he took was calculated. Every move was made with precision. He couldn't afford to slip up. His daughter's life was at stake, and he wasn't about to let these invaders take her without a fight. The aliens moved closer, their strange forms visible now in the distance. He could see their technology humming in the air above him, an unnatural glow that made his skin crawl. He didn't know how many there were, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't take them all on directly. There were too many unknowns. But he wasn't planning to fight them head-on. He just needed to keep them off balance, force them to react to him instead of the other way around. The father crouched low, his senses on high alert. He needed to be invisible, to blend in with the environment. Every sound, every movement had to be calculated. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The stakes were too high. His training had always taught him the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment. Now was that moment. He waited, listening carefully for any sign that the aliens had detected him. The faintest noise could give him away. He had to be ready when the time came. As the aliens moved closer to the house, he could feel the tension in the air. He knew they were searching for something, his daughter, most likely. They wouldn't stop until they found her, and he couldn't let that happen. His thoughts narrowed. The only way to stop them was to make sure they never got close enough to reach her. It was time. The father moved swiftly, using the cover of night to stay hidden from their sight. He had only one shot at this. His mind was sharp, and his body was ready. He was as prepared as he could be. The first step was to throw off their sense of direction. He triggered a noisemaker, a sudden, sharp sound that echoed in the trees. The aliens reacted immediately, their attention diverted. They paused, unsure, scanning the area with their glowing eyes. The father didn't waste a second. He moved quickly, using the noise as a distraction to get closer to their position. He could feel his adrenaline spiking as he neared them. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to spring into action. He had no idea what the aliens would do next, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. As the father crept forward, he saw one of the alien figures moving toward the edge of the house. This was his chance. With the smallest movement, he triggered another trap. A line of fishing wire stretched across their path. The wire snapped tight, pulling a bucket of rocks down from a tree. The sudden noise caught the aliens off guard, sending them into disarray. The father took advantage of their confusion. He moved fast, taking up position behind a thick tree. He was almost within reach of the group now, but he had to be careful. He couldn't risk getting caught. His next move had to be perfect. As the aliens began to regroup, the father reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flare gun. He had no idea how effective it would be against their technology, but it was the best option he had. He aimed the flare toward the center of their formation and fired. The flare shot into the sky, bursting in a brilliant display of light. The aliens recoiled, their forms shimmering in the sudden brightness. For a moment, they were disoriented, caught in the flash of light. The father didn't waste time. He sprinted toward the house, moving in a low crouch. The aliens were still recovering from the flare's explosion. This was his opening. As he neared the house, he saw the figure of his daughter in the window. She was still inside, unaware of the danger closing in. He couldn't let them reach her. He didn't care about the odds anymore. This wasn't about surviving. This was about stopping them, no matter the cost. He reached the door, locked from the inside, and quickly disabled the mechanism. He was inside in seconds, his heart pounding as he scanned the room for any signs of danger. The aliens were still recovering from the flare, and he could hear them moving outside. He had no idea how much time he had left. But he knew one thing: whatever happened next, he was ready. His mind was clear. His body was steady. He would protect his daughter, no matter what it took. The father's mind raced as the sound of the aliens' movements grew closer. He had no illusions about the danger. These weren't creatures he could simply confront head-on. They had advanced technology, a level of power he couldn't match. But he wasn't here to win a battle. He was here to survive, and to protect his daughter. Survival had always been the goal. Over the years, he'd learned how to use his surroundings, how to adapt. Now, he was about to put every lesson he had learned to the test. The night was unnaturally still as he prepared for what was coming. The aliens had come far too close, and there was no escaping now. He had no choice but to make his stand. His training told him that the key to victory wasn't in overwhelming force but in taking control of the situation. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was calculating every move, setting traps, misdirecting, and using his knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver them. The father's first concern was his daughter. She needed to be safe. He couldn't afford to let her be seen or taken. His mind stayed sharp as he checked the perimeter once more. The simple but effective traps he had set earlier remained in place. The aliens hadn't triggered them yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The alien technology was sophisticated, and they could likely bypass some of his basic defenses. But the father had one thing that they didn't: experience. He knew how to think fast, how to outthink his opponents. The figure that led the group of aliens moved with unnatural grace. Its glowing eyes scanned the area, its attention shifting in every direction, constantly searching for something. The father's heart beat faster, but he held steady. He knew that patience would be his greatest asset. His only chance now was to remain undetected and to use the environment to his advantage. He would wait for the perfect moment. It wasn't long before the aliens split up, moving in different directions. This was his chance. The father had anticipated this and was already in position. He silently moved through the shadows, following the path the aliens had taken, staying out of sight. He used the terrain to his advantage, keeping low to the ground, positioning himself behind the thick cover of the trees. He knew he couldn't afford to give himself away. The aliens were methodical, their steps measured, but they weren't used to being challenged. They seemed to move as if they had all the time in the world, but that would work in his favor. He wasn't going to fight them directly. Instead, he would push them into a corner, force them to make a mistake. The father set off another noise trap. This time, it was louder, more disruptive, and it caught their attention. He watched from a distance as the aliens quickly regrouped, their forms tense as they tried to locate the source of the sound. This was exactly what he had hoped for. The aliens were distracted, their focus fractured, and that opened the door for him to strike. The father didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, stepping into the space between two large rocks, positioning himself for the next phase of his plan. He didn't have much time, but the element of surprise was on his side. The aliens had been caught off guard before, and he intended to keep them off balance. As the aliens drew closer, the father was ready. His flare gun was in his hand again, loaded and aimed. This was his last chance. The flare would blind them, give him a window to move and strike. He waited until the perfect moment, until they were almost on top of him. Then he fired. The flare shot up into the sky, exploding in a burst of light that temporarily blinded the aliens. Their figures staggered backward, their glowing eyes narrowing as they tried to adjust. It was a brief moment of disarray, but that was all he needed. In the confusion, the father sprang into action. He moved quickly, silently, and with precision. With the aliens still reeling from the sudden flare, the father used the opportunity to close the gap. He was close now, too close for them to react in time. The father reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, something he had rigged together from his survival kit. It wasn't much, but it could do the job. He activated it, and the device emitted a high-pitched sound that disrupted their sensors, causing the aliens to pause, disoriented. They began to stumble, their movements slow and clumsy as they tried to locate the source of the interference. This was his opening. The father didn't wait to see if it was working. He knew it was. He sprinted past the aliens, moving in a blur of motion, and reached the house in seconds. He knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake now. His daughter was just inside, and he had no time to waste. He could hear the aliens behind him, their strange, echoing voices growing louder as they recovered from the distraction. But they were too far behind now. The father was already inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't stop to catch his breath. His daughter was still in her room, unaware of the danger outside. The father moved quickly, silently, making sure everything was locked tight. He knew they wouldn't stop coming. He had delayed them, but the aliens would be back, and they would bring more force next time. He didn't have the luxury of time. His mind was sharp, every sense on alert. He couldn't afford to relax, not for a second. There was no safety to be found in this fight. But he was ready for whatever came next. His training had always been about preparing for the worst, and he had done that. Now, it was about taking the fight to them, about doing whatever it took to keep his daughter safe. The father took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't let fear control him. He had made it this far, and he would keep going. No matter what. The aliens had underestimated him. They thought they could take what they wanted. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. The father's hands shook as he checked the locks on every door. He had to remain focused. There was no room for error now. His mind was a blur of calculations, survival tactics, and strategies. The aliens were relentless, but so was he. His daughter's safety was all that mattered. He couldn't allow himself to falter, not when they were so close. The next move had to be perfect. He needed to create a plan that would push them back and buy enough time to figure out a permanent solution. Outside, the sounds of the aliens' search grew louder. They were methodical, but they were not invincible. The father knew they had technology beyond anything he had ever faced, but that didn't mean they were untouchable. They made mistakes, and that was something he could exploit. His mind raced through every trick he'd learned over the years: how to mislead, how to distract, how to strike fast and hard when necessary. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The key was keeping them off balance. He moved quickly through the house, setting up more makeshift traps. Nothing elaborate, but enough to throw them off course. The house was small, and every inch mattered. He checked on his daughter again. She was still huddled in her room, unaware of how close the danger was. The father couldn't afford to let her down. His training had always been about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and he would not fail now. The father's thoughts turned to the aliens. He didn't know where they came from or what they wanted, but he had no intention of letting them succeed. They weren't just after his daughter, they were after something more, something he couldn't yet understand. Whatever their mission, he wasn't about to let them complete it. He would stop them, no matter what it took. He spent the next few minutes preparing. His military training had taught him to think ahead, to plan for the unexpected. He couldn't rely on brute force to defeat them, that was clear. He needed to outsmart them. The aliens didn't expect resistance. They were used to having the upper hand, to taking what they wanted without anyone standing in their way. But that arrogance would be their downfall. They had underestimated him, and now they would pay the price. The father moved silently, setting up the final pieces of his plan. He knew the aliens were close, but he also knew they were watching. Every move he made had to be calculated, had to be precise. He couldn't afford to make a noise, to give away his position. It wasn't just about the traps anymore. It was about getting them to think they had control, then using that belief against them. Outside, the first of the aliens appeared in his line of sight. It moved cautiously, its glowing eyes scanning the area. The father didn't flinch. He knew exactly what to do. He triggered one of his noisemakers, sending a loud sound echoing through the night. The alien turned, its attention diverted. The father moved quickly, closing the distance between them. The alien seemed disoriented by the sound, its steps faltering. The father seized the opportunity. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The flare gun was in his hand again, and this time, he knew it would count. He fired, the flare bursting into the sky, blinding the alien. It staggered back, its movements slowed, giving the father just enough time to reach his next position. The aliens were confused now, uncertain. They had expected a weak, unprepared target. What they had found instead was someone who knew how to fight, how to outthink them at every turn. The father could hear them regrouping, their voices echoing in the night. They would adapt soon, but that was fine. He didn't need more time. He had done enough to keep them off balance, to buy the precious moments he needed. He took one last look at his daughter, still in her room, still safe for now. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, but he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The aliens were backtracking, unsure of what was happening. The traps had worked. The father was breathing easier now, but only slightly. He knew the fight wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until they were gone, until he could be certain his daughter was safe from harm. The father's thoughts turned to the future. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. The aliens would learn from their mistakes, and next time they came, they would come stronger. But he would be ready. He always had been. His training had prepared him for the worst. He would adapt, just as they had.